Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about podcasts and how businesses utilize podcasts. Some quick hits here. Today we're going to be covering the development of podcasts, when they started and how they developed, the market size of podcasts and why podcast use will continue to grow, how and why businesses utilize those podcasts, and finally we're going to finish up with some podcast case studies. So first, when I was doing this research, I found that podcasts as we know it today started in 2004 and really took off after that as far as the development of download opportunities or download applications to download different podcasts to specific devices like the iPhone. Actually, one of the big things that I found in this is that smartphones really do drive podcast usage. So the whole premise behind podcasts is to take an audio file or a recording and be able to take it with you, be able to make it a lot more accessible and take it with you as you go. So in an ever cluttered world, those podcasts are functional means of multitasking. Since around 2014, that's when the huge spike of podcasts happened. You see the 157% spike in the last 5 years of mobile downloads, people taking their podcasts with them. Today, over 660,000 active podcasts are out there, which is a huge number. It actually grew about 100,000 in the span of 1 year from 2018 to 2019, and there are over 28 million episodes produced. So who are the people who are listening to those podcasts? Well, around 73 million Americans ages 12 and over listen to podcasts monthly. For perspective, that's about 26% of Americans, or just about as many people who use Twitter. 49% of the podcasting or the podcast listening is done at home, whereas 22% of listening is done in the car. So again, people are not only taking the podcasts with them, listening with them, but also listening at home, which will be important in the next couple of slides. You'll see on the right the chart that says that podcast listeners tend to be loyal, which is important for advertising, affluent, and educated, which kind of speaks to some of those stats there. One of the big ones to remember as we get into the advertising slide is 80% of people who start a podcast finish it. So again, very loyal, and podcast listening is very habit-forming. On average, consumers listen to about 7 podcasts per week. So thinking about all the podcasts out there, a lot of people are listening. As we move into the future of podcasting or listening to podcasts, it's going to become so much easier, and it already has become a lot easier for people to listen to those podcasts. As the development of Amazon Echo or Google Home technology increases, those people, for 49% who are listening in their home, it's going to be that much easier to listen in your home just to say, hey Alexa, play My Favorite Murder or play Lore podcast. Podcast reached about 60 million homes, and so that's growing as well. Remember, 22% listen in their cars, so as cars become much more internet compatible, that means that it's going to be that much easier to download those podcasts and to listen while you're driving. And as we move forward, we'll learn a little bit about brand marketing. As the growth of return on investment for those companies who are investing in advertising grows, so too will these podcasts. Just one quick note, I thought this was really interesting that podcasting seems to be everywhere here in the United States, and it's also a global trend. So if you're a business and you operate in South Korea, for instance, or Spain, it might be a good idea for your business, your company, to include part of their marketing strategy to be a part of, to use podcasts a lot more. So you can also see that even though about 26% of Americans are here in this study, 33% of Americans responded by saying, yes, I've listened to a podcast in the last month. That number could keep going up and up, something to keep in mind as a business. So this is where businesses really make their money, why businesses are in the advertising, in the podcast game. From 2016 to 2017, the amount of money that was invested in podcast advertising went up 85% and hit the $220 million number. So what studies are finding is that these podcast advertisements really are effective because 75% of listeners took action on a sponsored message that was included in a podcast advertisement. Um, what we'll talk about here in one of our case studies is companies are moving more and more towards branded podcasts, not just branded advertisements. So that's really been a development in the last few years as well. Um, there was a survey created that suggests that um, podcast listeners typically make it through about 90% of a given episode, and they're not skipping through ads. So that's really making these advertisements very effective. And then finally, the main podcast demographic is 18 to 34-year-olds, and that's a consumer base that's often really difficult for advertisers to reach out through traditional media, say through radio or through television. So this is a huge way that podcast developers, or excuse me, businesses using podcasts can reach out to this demographic and include them in their message. Really quickly here, I included two podcasts who use advertisements pretty effectively in the way that they present their advertisements. Both of these podcasts kind of spell out their own way of describing the advertised product to listeners. What ends up happening through these studies that they've been conducting, people who listen to podcasts tend to really trust and value what the podcast, or I guess the podcasters, really say. So in the My Favorite Murder example, these two women who run the podcast really make it fun and have used the products as well. And so they can really give a good recommendation for using the product. And like we were saying earlier, people typically don't skip through those advertisements, which shows that through traditional ad evaluation, podcast ads are actually very highly rated as far as aided and unaided recall, key message registration, and the percent of people who are listening to the entire message. So these podcast advertisements have been really effective. Finally, before we get to our case study here, why businesses use podcasts. So I included two podcast apps who are reaching out to their customers through new outlets or via new mediums. The Marketplace app, that's through NPR, so Marketplace runs from 6:30 to 7 every night. But if you can't catch that report, you can now listen via the Marketplace app. Similarly with Dana and Victory, the Dana and Victory podcast, they use the podcast to encourage people to listen and to go visit their site, either if you are a supporter or not a supporter of the website, but it gets their name out there for people who are interested in Xavier basketball to go and sign in and become a member on the site. One big thing here at the bottom, using podcasts helps businesses really effectively relate one-on-one to potential customers instead of just sending out a broad marketing strategy or a broad advertisement out. And also, advertising on these podcasts can be a lot more directed, which means your return on investment is a lot higher instead of just putting out a specific or a kind of a general ad on television or via radio. This way you know exactly who's listening to that podcast and what kind of message they want to hear. So I mentioned that podcasts are becoming a lot more branded by businesses in the last few years. I wanted to use Trader Joe's as an example with their Inside Trader Joe's podcast. I've actually listened to a few episodes myself, and it's actually really pretty good. What they do is they talk about, for each new season that opens up, what are the new products that they are bringing out for their stores. And also, like the most recent episode that they had was about sustainability with their products. So they kind of promote, here's how we are effective in selling our products and what kind of products we offer. And so, as an example, my fiance Claire loves Trader Joe's. So the reason we started listening to this podcast was because she loves Trader Joe's. But then when I started listening to the podcast, I started thinking, maybe I should go to Trader Joe's instead of going to Kroger or just a general supermarket, because it sounds like they really have some great products. Some other things that have been happening with podcasts is similar to Trader Joe's, but dissimilar in the sense that we have brands or companies who are sponsoring podcasts that really have as you see on the right, the ZipRecruiter name, but don't talk about the product itself. So with what GE did on the left with the message, it's a fictional science fiction podcast, but they decided to sponsor and create this podcast because it really linked well with what their brand stood for, with innovation. I guess science fiction. People who are interested in science fiction would also be good matches for their brand. And actually, that podcast became quite big, and one of the episodes kind of featured Neil deGrasse Tyson. So that's kind of interesting. On the right, the Rise and Grind podcast with Damon John. ZipRecruiter decided to sponsor and create that podcast because it's all about motivation in and outside of the office. And so they thought this would be a really great way to reach listeners base and future consumers because the ideas behind the Rise and Grind podcast fit really well with their brand. Finally, this is a fun way to kind of close out the case studies. McDonald's in 2017 put out their own podcast based on the Szechuan sauce incident. What happened was they had a promotion based on an old Szechuan sauce that was created in 1998, and the show Rick and Morty made it popular by doing a whole episode about the Szechuan sauce. So they decided to do a campaign to bring back some Szechuan sauce, but it was way bigger than they thought it would be. So when people showed up at their doors throughout the country and they ran out of Szechuan sauce, people started to riot at different stores. And so what they did is they, instead of just issuing a formal apology, they created a podcast, a 3-part podcast that I've listened to, and it's actually quite good. But it was all about what went wrong and how they were going to fix the problem in the future. Here are some of my references from where I kind of got some information. And I also included a few of those podcast links if you're interested in listening to the McDonald's podcast or the Inside Trader Joe's podcast. Finally, I have my discussion or reflection questions up here. So first, do you listen to podcasts? If so, how often? And how much has it become part of your day-to-day life? Do you ever listen to any business-branded podcasts? Does it influence your decisions that you make as a consumer? Does your company ever utilize podcasts as a way of reaching new customers? If yes, how effective is this technology for your company? And if no, do you think your company would benefit from podcasting? Do you think that podcasting is a smart way for companies to reach new audiences or to be more relatable to their current customers or consumers? And finally, what else could companies be doing with podcast technology that would benefit them in the short and long term? Thanks very much, and look forward to discussing this with you.